Hi everyone, today we're going to go over parts of the brain and their function. So this will go over a lot of the end of the chapter and also plasticity and neurogenesis. Okay, so I gave you a map of phrenology, and basically what you can do with that map is go ahead and feel around, use the map to see if the bumps on your brain, if they're more pronounced, that would be a part of your personality that would have been exposed. And that was the way that they first decided there was parts of the brain that went with specific functions. So it's obviously a pseudoscience. Produced and created by Franz Joseph Gall. And it really started sort of that scientific link between what's going on inside our brain and our personality traits. So it's something fun to try to do on your own. What does this actually lead to, though, is what's the most important part. So even though phrenology is a pseudoscience, it did lead to something important in psychology, and that is cortical localization, that specific brain functions are in specific parts of the brain. And as we talk about different functions of the parts of the brain, we can see how that is important. Okay, so one of the myths about the brain is that you only use 10% of it. So even with cortical localization, all of your parts of your brain are linked and are working integrated. And that's by neural pathways or neurons called tracks or bundles of axons. And this was found by the Human Connectome Project that used DSI imaging to find these really complex pathways that are all integrated in your brain. And if we think about this example that I'm going to give you, you can really see how that's really true. So, for instance, if you're reading and eating a sandwich at the same time, what is going on biologically in your brain? You would say something like, while reading, the frontal lobes in your cerebral cortex are engaged in thinking and reasoning. You're enjoying your delicious sandwich thanks to your parietal lobe, which is responsible for taste, texture, and smell of food. The occipital lobe helps to process how you see the words on the page, and the temporal lobe helps you process what you hear, like a crunch of your sandwich and the rustle of the page. Meanwhile, you just blinked because of your motor area, and it's because of your cerebellum that you're able to hold the sandwich in your hand as well as anything else you're doing right now that calls for balance and coordination, like sitting. Without thinking, you're breathing, digesting your sandwich, digesting your sandwich, it's very small, and circulating blood thanks to your brainstem. Your metabolism and hormonal functions, like the ones that control water and sugar level in your body, are controlled by your pituitary gland. And if you're sitting outside on a park bench on a cold, wintry day, your hypothalamus is responsible for the fact that you're shivering. You remember that what you're reading due to your hippocampus, whose job is to transfer short-term to long-term memory. So you can see it's really complex. Eating a sandwich and reading has all those parts. This actually, for example, would be something that you might write for an FRQ. So like bringing on as many things, something very simple and general like reading and eating a sandwich, you would expand out and really talk about vocabulary and how it's functioning. So that's just to go to show like everything that's working together as we talk about each part. Okay, so when we talk about the brain, we want to first start with plasticity and neurogenesis. Why is it so powerful to know that brain can change function and structure? Well, that's really very important because if we ever do to damage it or something were to affect it, we want to make sure that our body can repair itself. So functional plasticity is the fact that the brain can shift from damaged to undamaged areas after rehabilitation has occurred. That's what happened in somebody who's had a stroke. And if some part of their arm is not working, they can eventually use the left side of their brain in order to shift that function until they can rehabilitate and so forth for that new area to take over. Structural plasticity and neurogenesis are important because it's the brain's ability to change its physical structure in response to learning and environmental influences. So if a child grows up in an environment where they are neglected and part of something is not working, because they get into a new environment means that you can actually structurally change and grow those neurons or neurogenesis and create and increase those connections and abilities because you are increasing neuron activity. So it's really powerful when we talk about like things that can affect your brain. So one of the things that they did was a study, as you guys read, about learning to juggle. As if you remember, they used an MRI and they showed brain scans before people learned to juggle, and then during, and then after. And what they found was, as you can remember, that those areas important for perceiving, remembering, and anticipating visual motions, they grew 3 to 4% in gray matter, which means that they're getting neurons because that's the cell bodies and also the cell bodies and the axons that are giving it that gray matter. What was really interesting is that after 3 months of not doing the juggling, it decreased. So if you use it, you lose it. A lot of us have said that a lot of times in education. If you just stop learning, your brain is going to decrease in some matter, and then that happens even more so when you age. There's even changes in the hippocampus that they've done. Remember the study that Gould did with primates with learning how to do learning and memory with using video games. And so what she found in those primates is that new neurons were created in the hippocampus because of all that. And so that's going to affect memory and how much you can actually learn. I have a video out there. It's for you guys to look at after you finish this. And it's on Does Video Games Rot Your Brain? And it does some like little tests and things like that. It shows you actually what that answer to the question is. So I won't tell you what it is, but you can watch the video and find out. One of the most important things about neurogenesis is that it can be affected by age. Obviously, when you grow older, your neurons are going to degenerate. So there's things that you can do to counteract that. At the end of the chapter, it talked about exercise, especially in learning something new. So you can also remember like how stress can actually affect neurogenesis. And then if you're in an enriching environment, which is also at the end of the chapter, how that can really help to keep neurons going. So one researchers found in Sweden is that the brain has more plasticity than they originally thought. Oligodendrocytes produce myelin, we know that. And previous studies showed that when the nervous cells of laboratory animals needed more myelin, the oligodendrocytes were replaced for cells that worked. So researchers assumed that this was the same for humans, and what they found was that's not exactly true. In humans, oligodendrocytes generation is very low. But when myelination needs to be produced, it's modulated and will increase if necessary. So we are really adaptive and so forth. So researchers examined the brain of 55 diseased people under 1 years old to 92, and they were able to establish that at birth, most oligodendrocytes are immature and that they rapidly will mature as we get older, meaning that they are malleable and they won't just disappear. It'll actually become more strong. So that means that, you know, our plasticity is actually a lot stronger than we thought and can happen a lot more readily than we think. Okay, so one of the things that can help with neurogenesis is exercise. So I always promote this at the beginning of the year. I want you guys to think about how much exercise you're getting. And there's many different benefits for exercise besides cardiovascular. There's also things with the mind that we want to talk about as well. So one of the things that happens when you exercise is there's a blood flow to hippocampus. So think about how powerful that is. If you've got more activity in your hippocampus, how much better your memory is going to be. In addition to that, we know that it increases brain matter or brain volume, and it can increase, and that's the reason, is because it's increasing your number of neurons, and it can increase your cognitive ability. All right, it also increases mitochondria by producing catecholamines, which we'll learn about in the stress unit, and that's going to increase your energy that you're going to need. So think about how much exercise you're getting a day. The Center for Disease Control says we need at least 150 minutes per week of moderately intense activity. So that's going to mean for you guys 50 minutes. Can you do 50 minutes a day? 50 minutes, sorry, 3 times a week. Or can you do 5 days and do 30 minutes of moderately intense? Pick which one, and that's really going to have a benefit for all the things besides cardiovascular. Okay, and so in conjunction with that, let's look at what the World Health Organization is saying about exercise. Dr. James Levine from Mayo Clinic says we are sitting ourselves to death. That's even worse now with quarantine and with COVID and with digital learning are sitting is more dangerous than smoking is what they're coming up with. The World Organization reported in 2017 that 80% of the world's adolescent population is not getting sufficient physical activity. So cell phones, computers, video games, TV, and so forth. And the University of Minnesota linked physical activity and positive mental health outcomes. And when you exercise, it raises your endorphins and also your serotonin. And what was really powerful is they did a study with those that were depressed, and patients actually stopped taking Zoloft, and exercise had the same effect as taking the drug on their depression. So in a 10-month mark study, this is what they found out. 62% were like healthy, okay? So out of 100%, only 62% of just taking the medication. 69% if it was the medication and they added exercise, and 92% reported that they felt better with just exercise alone. Those are the three experimental groups they had. So that's really, really powerful when you think about not only cognitive ability, but also mental stability. And if you're having issues with that, that's where we need to start, is having exercise be put into your regimen for various things. Okay, one other really interesting thing about the brain is when we have a lack of neurogenesis and we have damage. And one of the things that we talk about is CTE, and we did that at the very intro. But here's some things about what the stages are of that. So stage 1 of CTE is going to look like headaches, loss of attention and concentration, somewhat similar to a concussion. In stage 2, people find themselves depressed and have mood swings, can be very explosive at times, and they have executive functioning skills, like they can't plan and organize and things like that. Some language difficulties, impulsivity, and some potential for suicidal thoughts. In stage 3, there's executive dysfunctioning as well, memory loss, difficulty with attention and concentration, and this is where they start to have depression or mood swings, visual spatial difficulties where they're like missing by picking up things, and can become very aggressive. And according to Boston University, 75% of people studied with the stage 3 were considered cognitively impaired, that there was a definite learning disability stage at that point. Stage 4 is the most severe stage, obviously. This is where you have the most memory loss, and they can have symptoms like dementia. And researchers have found that most of the people studied had developed a profound loss of all of their cognitive abilities, have a lot of paranoia and aggression as well. And according to Boston University, less common symptoms might be like Parkinsonism, like some Parkinson's disease sort of like symptoms, and that most causes of death for CTE are respiratory failure. You have a degeneration of specific areas in the brainstem, cardiac disease, suicide, overdose, which are both obviously connected to depression, and then also early stages of dementia can also be. So there's really some powerful things about concussions and brain injuries, and how it can lead to some really difficulties with behavior and thinking. Okay, so let's get into the parts of the brain, which is super cool. I'm going to break this down for you guys so you can review the information really easily. So we have like 3 major areas, okay? Forebrain, hindbrain, and midbrain, and we're going to talk about each one of those. So let's talk about the hindbrain, okay? This is the most primitive part of our brain. Everybody needs this part of your brain because it's the way that we function. And it is called the old brain as well. So this is where sensory and motor paths pass through here and go to the cerebral cortex. So although it's an area that deals with a lot of heart rate, vital, life functions, it's also sort of this transportation area where all these things are going to be going up into the cerebral cortex, and that's what makes it really powerful. It has 2 major sections, as you can see on the left, so the cerebellum and then the brainstem. And the brainstem is broken down into 3, although it says 2 there: medulla, the rectal formation, and the pons. Okay, so let's start with the cerebellum. The cerebellum's at the very top. It's that squishy little area that's above the brainstem, or to the right of it at least, and it is there for coordination and balance and posture. Okay. And that is if the cerebellum, if anybody is drinking alcohol, that's going to affect the cerebellum. And that's always why people are sort of tipsy, right? Because their balance is off. The cerebellum is also, though, involved in learning habitual and automatic movements. So if you learn to ride a bike, you don't have to think about that. It's automatic, and that's actually where it's sort of involved, is in the cerebellum. If it's damaged, you're going to have jerky movements that are not like full of posture and coordination and movement. And so that's where that would be an issue if the cerebellum is damaged. Okay, the other ones that are involved, obviously, is the medulla, and that controls your breathing, heart rate, and your functions. It also connects the brain to the spinal cord, and it is that coordination. We talked about those ascending messages of neurons and descending, like when you're touching something hot. And it's going to coordinate those and the neurons to crisscross the body. Okay, so if we know that we have that quadrilateral organization. And what is quadrilateral organization? It is sensory information crossing from one side of the body to the opposite side of the body. So your right of your brain coordinates with the left side of your body, and the left side of your brain coordinates to the right. And the medulla helps to coordinate those ascending and descending neurons to do what they need to do to respond to things. At the core of the medulla is the rectal formation, and it is important for attention, arousal, and sleep. Okay, and then we have the pons, as you can see to the left-hand side in that yellow area. It's going to help coordinate movements from the left and the right side of the body. It's known as the bridge, and it connects the cerebral cortex with the cerebellum and the spinal cord. It has a lot of involvement in those neural pathways, and it also helps control sleep, awakening when you want to awake, and also dreaming. Okay. So what's the unique fact about strokes as we talk about this area? Damage on the left side of the brain is going to show up, left side of the brain is going to show up on the right side. Okay, so if somebody has a droopy face on the right side of their body, that means the left side of their brain was damaged in some fashion and so forth. So that's where we see that quadrilateral organization. Okay, let's go to the midbrain. Midbrain is really quick because the midbrain is a relay station for auditory and visual sentences. Very, very small, and it's that red portion that you see in the chart there, or in the picture there. And it has one particular, the substantia nigrea is the main one that we talk about in there. But there's also other little parts in there that are really getting technical, and we don't need to get to. But this area of the brain is going to process visual information with eye movements to locate and track objects, and it's going to relay information like auditory things and visual to sensory areas in the forebrain, so all that area up here. Okay, what we talked about last time was or a few days ago, was Parkinson's disease and that degeneration of neurons. Well, that's going to happen in the substantia nigrea, which is responsible for motor control. And so you can see where that particular area is where dopamine producing neurons lie in the midbrain. And so because those are where dopamine is, if there's something happening, there's too little of that dopamine, then we're going to have an issue with degeneration and then have Parkinson's disease as a possible injury to the brain. Okay, let's talk about the limbic system. What's responsible for emotion, memory, connection to emotion? That's your amygdala. So your amygdala, if you're hangry, if you're angry, your amygdala is, and you're hungry, that's one of the things that will end up happening. You'll get very agitated. What part is responsible for forming new memories? That's the hippocampus, and that's where neurogenesis can occur here when we talk about exercise. What part is responsible for processing and distributing sensory and motor information to the cerebral cortex? That is the thalamus, and this is also regulates a lot of awareness, attention, motivation, and emotional aspects of senses. And it's a relay station as well, but it has a lot more to do with those other functions as well. And what does the hypothalamus do? Well, that's like our brain within a brain. It's going to do all kinds of things. It regulates things for survival, hunger, thirst, sleep, and sexual behavior. It regulates some of our automatic systems like heart rate, and produces neurotransmitters that affect the pituitary gland, as we learned about not last time. In the hypothalamus, pathways ascend to the forebrain and then descend to the mid and the high brain. So that's why it's like really important. It's sort of this really good connector. The limbic system in general, and I'm wondering where there it is. The limbic system in general is a system of complex neural circuits that focus on learning, memory, and emotional control. And as you can see there, it's part of, a lot of them are part of the forebrain. It's not part of the midbrain. It's its own system that sort of lies somewhat between the two of them. But you can see there's 4 major parts that we will talk about all year with the limbic system. Okay, and one important video I have out there is this story about HM and the hippocampus. He's one of the most famous brains in history, and he has some issues because his hippocampus was removed in formation of memory and how it connects to the frontal cortex. The hippocampus is where your short-term memory will start. So things that come in from all senses and so forth are going to be processed in the hippocampus, and then that's sent to the forebrain or to your prefrontal cortex, and that's where it has long-term memory. And if you don't have your hippocampus, then you do have some issues with short-term memory. So watch the idea about Henry. That was him when he got his surgery, and then that's him before he died. But it's a really fascinating story about how the brain works even when you lose a part of it. Okay, the forebrain is the largest, as you can imagine, 90% of your brain, and you can see from the picture, you've got the forebrain up in the top there, and then pituitary gland is next to where the midbrain is, and then the hindbrain, of course, is the cerebellum and the spinal cord you can see there. But the cerebral cortex is a major part of the forebrain, and it's divided into the 2 hemispheres, as you know, and the 2 hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum, and it's about a inch thick, got it there, and it's made of grayish, has a grayish appearance because of the glial cells and then the neural cell bodies and axons that make up that. White matter that you have in your brain is the myelin, that's what makes it white. And these connect the cerebral cortex to other brain regions as well. And what's really cool to think about is like it's so big in there, and there's all grooves and things that if you were to spread out your brain, it would take about 3 square feet to spread out a human adult brain, which is pretty amazing. It all fits into our head. What's different about animal brains than human brains? That's the size of the cortex. The size of this is much bigger for us because we're more a complex animal. Okay, and then in your cerebral cortex, you've got 4 lobes, and then you've got associated areas, and you've got other areas that are in those as well. So let's talk about the frontal lobe. That's all of your thinking, planning, problem solving, and so forth, and that contains the primary motor cortex, which is basically representation of functions based on the importance of the movement. So in that area, we have a lot of the primary motor cortex has a lot of neurons and things that are connected to hands and facial movements. We have so many facial expressions we can make as a human being, and that is represented in the primary motor cortex that's in that frontal lobe. And you can see the motor cortex at the top there. It's kind of that like reddish brownish color there. And then, so that's the front, and then the parietal is right below it and behind it. So I think about like I'm thinking about something important, but I'm perceiving it. Perceiving is the first thing we do, but this is the second. But if I'm thinking and awake, I'm kind of using this, and when I'm dreaming, I'm using my parietal lobe. It's because it's all that perceptual stuff. So that makes sense of the world and so forth, and all the perceived things that we have. It contains the somatosensory cortex, which does a lot of perception of touch and pressure, and it uses contralateral organization for touch receptors and for receptors from muscles and joints. So if you're touching something on the left-hand side, then the somatosensory cortex that's on the right is kind of picking that up because of pressure and touch. In the back, we think of, if somebody says, I have eyes in the back of my head, that's a occipital, and that's your visual cortex, and that contains all the things coming in that are visual. It's perceiving those things, and that primary visual cortex is doing that. The temporal lobe is right, and I don't really know something to remember for temporal. because it's temperature, which we think is parietal. So you just have to remember that's near your ears, okay? And your ears are your auditory, and that's going to receive sound. So obviously that's going to be involved in memory and understanding and language because of the auditory part of it. So those are your 4 lobes and your cortexes that are involved in each one. And then beyond that, we have associated areas. So throughout the year, they're going to be talking about associated areas of the cerebral cortex. So you can see some of those prefrontal, limbic, and parietal, temporal, and occipital, and they show you kind of where those are and what they do. Generally, they process and integrate sensory and motor information. So for instance, the prefrontal associated cortex plans for voluntary movements. The others will then integrate perceptions and with memories and so forth. So it kind of works together with all the other cortexes to bring together everything when it comes to memory and integration. And then one interesting story that you can watch for a video in an assignment is going to be on Phineas Gage, and what happened with his behavior. He got a rod put into his head, did not die, and it changed his behavior to a completely different personality. So this caused damage to his frontal lobe, but what was interesting is looking at how it dealt with his emotions and also his memory and so forth. And Phineas Gage's brain is actually still on display, or they still have it, kind of like Einstein's brain. They still have it. They still look at it to see, because it was such an amazing story. Okay, and then we get to the Broca areas and the Wernicke areas of the brain. So what is the Brioches area? That's the left. They're all both on the left there. You can see it in the picture to the right there. It is the left lower frontal lobe, as you can see, and that's for speech production. And that's the important thing is to remember, speech production, actually being able to speak. So the Wernicke's area is actually the actual comprehension of speech, but also written word. And so we know that the left side of the brain deals with language and language production. So that the left side, we know if it's damaged, we will have some issue with speech, either comprehension or production. We also know from this study that they've done and found these 2 areas that lateralization of function is a thing. So there's more control of a behavior in one hemisphere than the other side of the brain. So because they found these 2 areas, they know lateralization happens. That one side of the brain has more control than the other side of the brain. And so this is obviously an example of cortical localization or localization of function. Please remember, though, the brain works and integrates everything together. So the types of language disruptions you might have with damage would be aphasia. So that's a partial or completely inability to articulate ideas or understand because of a brain injury. And so Brioche's aphasia is going to be a difficulty or impossible actually producing speech. And that comprehension is fine. That's what makes it frustrating, but they just cannot speak. Brioche's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia is a difficulty to comprehend written or spoken language, and they can speak, but they have trouble finding words, and so some words like come out just whatever, like it's kind of like nonsense, kind of like the story in your book. Another interesting one that is something that was a damage to the brain that has nothing to do with speech was one of my students last year had aphantasia, and this was a damage to the brain, and what happened was after that she had no ability to imagine or had no dreams. They cannot imagine. So if you guys can think of like closing your eyes and imagining something happening, she could not do that. So one of the things was she's in band and they were like, imagine the notes, and she's like, I can't do that. I can't close my eyes and imagine anything. That sense of perception, her visual cortex was probably damaged from, I think she hit her head on something, and she literally can't dream. So she doesn't visualize anything with that visual associated area that is used with dreaming, which is kind of interesting too. Okay, and then one of the really cool videos that you're going to watch is on split brain. So the split brain operation was done in 1940, and they, as you guys read it, they didn't think there was any real effect. Like they split the corpus callosum. They were trying to disrupt the disorganized neurons that were firing from one hemisphere to another, and they were trying to help epileptic patients from not having seizures. So Michael Gonzaga is a researcher that has worked with this gentleman that you're going to watch for 13 years, and he had the same surgery for epileptic seizures. And it's really cool to see how the brain works if you separate both hemispheres. He's still obviously alive, but as you can see, when Roger Sperry looked at this and tested split brain patients, just like Michael Gonzaga is doing, you can see that they were discovering that there were some differences, that it did actually have an impact on people. There's more information now because of split brain on lateralization of functions and the idea that the left and the right brain have specific functions and certain functions. So if you look at the top there, we have somebody with a split brain, and they're looking at something from their right side. So it still crosses over, meaning that your right brain is looking on the left side and so forth. It's just what is being able to be produced on either side of the brain. So when they're showed it on the left side, and they're asked, what do you see? They said, I don't see anything, because that's the nonverbal, like right side. But when they're said, hey, can you now grab what you just saw? They literally will grab a hammer. Their brain, even though they can't produce that name hammer, or they don't know what they saw, their brain processes seeing the hammer, and they actually can pick it up, not knowing like how to verbalize it. In the video, you're going to see that same thing happen, where the split brain patient looks at a word. They don't think they've seen the word, and they actually draw a picture, and they try to figure out what their brain actually saw by looking at a picture. It's really, really cool. So you guys got to watch it. So you can see another example at the bottom there. When you switch it to the other side, now they're able to use the left side with the apple or with the key. They can actually see, because they're using the left side of their brain, and that side of the brain produces language, and they're able to actually, like, their brain can see it on the right side. They just can't verbalize it because they don't have, it's like having two different brains. So if they see it with the right, they can't say it because it's not the left side where we know that they produce speech. But if they see it on the left, the apple or the key from the left side, they can actually say it's a key or an apple, because it's that side of the brain is able to produce language. Super cool. So that lateralization, you can really see that function. And they do some really cool things with them that you need to look at in the video. Language reading and speech functions are performed primarily by the left, as seen here, and that nonverbal, emotional, visual, spatial is on the right side. Things like puzzles, recognizing faces, copying and drawing, and reading maps is done on your right side. So that localization, even though they're integrated, and we know that from the split brain that they are integrated because they will function separately, but there are specific parts of the brain that do certain things. Okay, and then some things about men and women and right side, left side brain. So everybody's heard about left side, right side, and what am I? And that's actually really much of a pseudoscience. They've done MRI scans, and they saw that there's no real difference between left or right. That left and right, there could be, like we were talking about, some more activated areas and more control over a particular function, but everything is integrated. And that the greater the task, the more likely that both hemispheres are working together. That primary sensory and motor areas are in the same place and perform the same way also proves that there isn't a left or a right side brain. Sorry, fun thing to try to figure out, but not true. And then the proverbial, like, men and women, are they different? You know, battle of the brains. You see all these like advertisements for, you know, a new way of showing the connectivity of brain called connectome maps reveal significant differences between men and women and so forth. And then there's ideas of like the male and the female brain. And what they've really, as you guys read, was that, you know, there's not a lot of differences when it comes to man and female and male brains. Gender comes from the idea that authors have come up with these things like men are from Mars and women are from Venus. That, you know, got people thinking that men and women are completely different. And they're different because they're hardwired by genes and hormones. Obviously, their hormones are different, but the brain of a person is not. Gender differences obviously are then affected by behaviors and attitudes and personality traits, and shaped by cultural norms. So that has more to do with it than brains actually being completely different. The findings they did find was that men's brains are larger due to skulls being larger. Women have more gray and white matter. Men have more gray matter in their left hemisphere, and male is more asymmetrical and functions are more lateralized, one side dominant kind of things, why women use both of their hemispheres. Females have stronger language skills and males have stronger spatial skills, which may lead people to say that they're different, but that's very small. Reality is the sweeping claims about fundamental sex differences are misleading. Some findings, like you said, like I just said on the left, were really not replicated studies, which is why we talked about that research part, and that there's really minimal differences that they found. Differences that are biological in origin are not fixed, permanent, or inevitable for all men and women, so you can't, generalize it and say that they're all the same. And development can be affected by a lot of things, and so forth, environment, men and women having different experiences, hormones, things like that. So really, when we talk about men and women's brains being different, it is not true as well.